Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to rise today to be part of the discussion on Bill C-58 because, as many of the members of the opposition have pointed out with some degree of consistency and clarity, this is perhaps the best example of the legacy of broken promises by this government. And in fact, this specific broken promise, Mr. Speaker, is in effect 31 broken promises. Because you will see in the midst of my speech, I will address how this isn't just a simple broken promise. It affects the entire open government concept paraded by the Liberals in the last election, and actually goes to the heart of the sincerity of the Prime Minister on this subject, Mr. Speaker, as many of his new members of Parliament who were not here in this last session when the Prime Minister was leader of the third party. You'll learn, if you stay and listen to my speech, that this was a centerpiece of his time as MP for Papineau, Mr. Speaker, but he seems to forget his passions from opposition, Mr. Speaker. I do have to say that my friend, the member from Kings Hants, the President of the Treasury Board, interestingly in his remarks on this bill last week, spoke a lot about his time in the Cabinet and how proud he was to be in the Cabinet of Paul Martin, Mr. Speaker. What was absent is he's now not in the Cabinet of Paul Martin. He's in the Cabinet of the current Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, but he didn't seem to work that into his remarks, possibly because he was handed the biggest broken promise of the new session, Mr. Speaker, and that's never fun as a minister to have a Prime Minister make you come to the Commons and try and sell a dead fish, Mr. Speaker, and that's essentially what this bill is. I'll remind the members of this Parliament who did run on the Liberal platform of their promise, Mr. Speaker. We all remember the various hashtags used by this government in the last election: hope and hard work, real change. Well, real change was the title of their policy platform, Mr. Speaker. And what was contained in that platform, Mr. Speaker? I'll quote, "We will ensure that access to information applies to the Prime Minister's office and ministers' offices, as well as to administrative institutions supporting Parliament or the courts," end quote, Mr. Speaker. That was real change in the section of their platform that talked about open and accountable government, Mr. Speaker. Page before that in that document, they also talked about real independence and listening to government watchdogs like the Information Commissioner, Mr. Speaker. And many Information Commissioners had provided commentary that the Liberals suggested they were going to act on, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure there's countless former watchdogs quite disappointed that the Liberals ran on this commitment but have fallen far short, Mr. Speaker. Because I said, if you look at that promise from their campaign to earn the trust of Canadians, they said the Prime Minister's office would be governed by access to information, as well as all ministers' offices. So if you look, it's not just the Prime Minister's office, there's actually 31 different offices that they pledged to bring under the umbrella of access to information. That's 31 broken promises contained in Bill C-58, Mr. Speaker. So, of the litany of broken promises, this is probably the most ambitious of the government, because you get 31 broken promises in one, Mr. Speaker. I would love to have seen emails with respect to the Prime Minister's trip to the private island, Mr. Speaker, along with now the Minister of Veterans Affairs and various members of Canada 2020/Liberal Party of Canada that I have a hard time distinguishing them, Mr. Speaker. We do know dribs and drabs from that trip because senior officials in the Privy Council office had a hard time making sure the Prime Minister could remain in touch. This is a secluded billionaire's island, Mr. Speaker, so the Government of Canada had a hard time keeping up with the vacation ambitions of the Prime Minister. I would love, had he kept his promise, to read a little bit about what his senior officials thought and how they were pushing the government to accommodate this very unusual request. Similarly, the investigations that the Prime Minister of Canada is certainly the subject of, or currently the subject of, with both the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbyist Commissioner, in itself, Mr. Speaker, unparalleled to have a Prime Minister subject to one, let alone two investigations in his first 2 years. I guess that's real change, Mr. Speaker. Certainly a big change from Mr. Harper. There were no investigations over 9 years of those officers of Parliament. Now we have two. I would have loved to see emails from Jerry and Katie talking about how to handle this with respect to the Prime Minister's fundraising dinners with Chinese billionaires, the same ones building a statue of his father in Canada before his government builds a statue and monument to the Afghanistan mission. The Trudeau Foundation is going to make sure Pierre Trudeau has a monument before the 40,000 Canadians who served in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. I would love to see a little bit of the commentary on that, Mr. Speaker. What we've heard in the government members, and I think we're at the beginning stages of debate, so we'll hear these talking points quite regularly now, Mr. Speaker, is instead of keeping their promise and providing that 31 offices would now be subject to the Access to Information Act, they're going to produce proactive disclosure, Mr. Speaker. This is their key defense to their broken promise. So they're going to release some schedules and agendas and some draft question period documents and say, hey, this should satisfy you. No, it doesn't, Mr. Speaker. Because as you'll see if you stay with me for a few moments, this is far more than a broken promise in the Real Change campaign document to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. And why is that? I'm going to refer to remarks made by the Liberal MP for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor, good guy I might add, a friend, who said in the last Parliament, I quote, "It's almost seemed that the Conservatives wanted to have a little more proactivity involved in the sense of what we are doing here with the Liberal Party of Canada, when in fact we're the ones who've brought forward far greater measures on proactive disclosure than this House has ever seen." End quote. He goes on in that speech, a really good speech he gave, Mr. Speaker. I recommend that member and some of his colleagues refer to it. The same speech he said this, quote, "A country's access to information system is the heart of open government." End quote, Mr. Speaker. Wonderful words by my friend from Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor, the longest-serving member in this House from Newfoundland and Labrador. Why such eloquent prose, Mr. Speaker? What was that member speaking about in the last Parliament? He was speaking about a private member's bill on reforming access to information, Mr. Speaker. Who brought forward that bill? The MP for Papineau, Mr. Speaker. Now the Prime Minister of Canada, whose own private member's bill in the last Parliament championed open government and reform of access to information, Mr. Speaker. No wonder my friend from Newfoundland and Labrador, when he spoke, was so eloquent in his praise and prose. It was his leader's bill, his leader's raison d'etre as the MP for Papineau, Mr. Speaker. And so that bill, C-613, which I always found interesting, all government officials are generally in the 613 area code, so I always thought Bill C-613 was kind of ironic. It was the Open Government Bill, area code 613, Mr. Speaker. But the actual name of the bill was an act to amend the Parliament of Canada Act and the Access to Information Act, in brackets, transparency, Mr. Speaker. So we know that for private members to have a bill tabled and debated in this House, it will be the most important issue to that member. We've seen some great bills brought forward by passionate members of Parliament. My friend from Caribou, Prince George, Mr. Speaker, who brought forward a national framework for post-traumatic stress disorder for our first responders. His passion in this Parliament we've debated. So in the last Parliament, when the Prime Minister was leader of the third party, what was his passion, Mr. Speaker? access to information reform and open government. Someone in the PMO should remind him of that, Mr. Speaker. They should send him an email. Now, we won't be able to see those emails because he's carving that out of these reforms, Mr. Speaker, but someone should remind the member from Papineau. He still is the member from Papineau. He's also the Prime Minister, and I respect that role, but I'm here to remind him what he brought to Parliament in the last session, Mr. Speaker, when he would regularly grill the Conservative government of the day. I remember, Mr. Speaker, I was in Cabinet. So, from the Prime Minister's bill on reforming and improving access to information, what did it start with? Section 2, the purpose was to, I quote, "Purpose of this act is to extend the present laws of Canada to provide a right of access of information to records under the control of all government institutions in accordance with principles that the government information must be made openly available to the public and accessible." Mr. Speaker, that was the thrust of the Prime Minister's private members' legislation. In fact, it went on to talk about when it should be held back, Mr. Speaker, and I'll refer to Section 2B of that, 2(1)B of that bill. Necessary exceptions to the right of access should be rare, limited, and specific. Mr. Speaker, with this bill, this farce of a bill, how does it measure up against the Prime Minister's Bill C-613? It fails, Mr. Speaker, dramatically, terribly. So the hope and hard work the Prime Minister championed in opposition is long forgotten. His hopes and his promises on open government, Mr. Speaker, which made it all the way to the Liberal platform, were dropped once he formed government, Mr. Speaker. And I hope Canadians see this for what it is, because yet again, the photo ops and the hashtags don't match the conduct of this government. Mr. Speaker, I'll leave the Prime Minister's office with one last quote. You know, they weren't here with the member from Papineau in the last Parliament. No, the Prime Minister's office was not here, Mr. Speaker. My friend from Winnipeg is heckling me, but he remembers early on, we Canadian taxpayers paid to move the Prime Minister's officials to Ottawa. Remember that? So I know they weren't here. We paid for them to come after you won. I would like those officials, Mr. Speaker, through you, to also look at Section 2(4), where it says, in the event of any uncertainty as to whether an exception applies to a record requested under this Act, the principle set out in paragraph 2(1)A applies, and the record shall be made available. And Section 2(1)A is that all government information must be openly available, Mr. Speaker. So this was the Prime Minister's raison d'etre in the last Parliament. And he's now brought a bill through his President of the Treasury Board to this House that would get an F if it was graded alongside what he suggested, not just in the election campaign, but as a private member of this House. So, as I said, not only is this broken promise 31 broken promises, because every minister of that front bench, he said, would have to disclose and have their offices open to disclosure under the Access to Information Act. That was a broken promise. A couple rows of Parliament, Mr. Speaker. And then he said the purpose was to always lean in favor of disclosure. Holding back documents should be rare and specific. Whereas in this bill, Mr. Speaker, there's also a section that says if in the opinion of someone it's a frivolous request, they don't have to disclose it either. So that's an exception that you can drive a truck through, Mr. Speaker, in terms of, you know, what they might consider frivolous. So the lofty language and goals of the Prime Minister in the last Parliament certainly didn't make their way into Bill C-58, Mr. Speaker. And my colleague from Louis Saint Laurent did a great job in outlining our opposition concerns with this bill. But I want officials in that Prime Minister's office to remind the Prime Minister of not only his commitments in the election, but his commitment to this Parliament. His only private member's bill was on access to information and reform of Parliament. And whether it's Bill C-58 or his commitments to never use omnibus bills, I've lost track of how many omnibus bills we've had, how many times the House Leader has brought forward a time allocation. The rhetoric of the Liberals in opposition, Mr. Speaker, when held up alongside their actual record in government, is hypocrisy of the highest order. And this bill is probably the best example. In the time I have remaining, because I always don't like being the voice of doom, Mr. Speaker, but this government, just every bill they bring forward, just gives me hours worth of material. But I do, as a parliamentarian, want to use some time to thank Madame Suzanne Legault, who served Canada with great distinction and capability as our Information Commissioner for many years, Mr. Speaker. And many of her recommendations and the work she did actually at the vanguard of global open government access to information was the basis of the Prime Minister's bill and the Prime Minister's old thinking in this area. Once he got sworn in, he forgot all that. So I'm sure Madame Legault, like many other people, are disappointed. But here's what she said when I happened to be at committee with her in the previous Parliament in December of 2014. She said, I quote, "Over the years, I've also made recommendations to the President of the Treasury Board on various ways to advance accountability and transparency. I'm very pleased that most of these recommendations over the years have been implemented by the government." That was the Information Commissioner's testimony before committee in the last Parliament. So you heard the last Liberal speaker say Stephen Harper was not in favor of open government. It was a one-man show, I think was her language. That simply was not true, Mr. Speaker. That was a narrative the Prime Minister liked to bring forward, and it led to his bill and his showboating on this subject. But it's actually not the testimony of our Officer of Parliament. That was her quote, that generally governments under her tenure had responded. Generally, the President of the Treasury Board had responded to modernizations, Mr. Speaker. So I hope the Liberals remove out of their talking points aspersions they're casting at Mr. Harper, because it's simply not true. And I'd refer them to the testimony of Madame Legault and her great record, Mr. Speaker. I gave her some difficult questions that day, and she handled it with capability and aplomb, and ran her department very effectively. This bill is giving more resources to the department, and I think that's needed because her lapse in the last Parliament, I think she lapsed $30,000. So literally, I've never seen a department run so efficiently. It's impossible for a government to meet all their estimates right on. There's always going to be a lapse or a request for more funds. So they ran a very capable program at a time that under her watch, there was a 30% increase in access to information requests, Mr. Speaker. 30%. So that department used technology and a number of other means to modernize. Another thing I see lacking in this bill, and this is something I spoke about in the last Parliament, is Access to Information Act comes from 1983, when the Prime Minister's father was the Prime Minister. And the cost for an access to request was $5 in 1983. It has not changed, Mr. Speaker, and I think it should, because the testimony given by Madame Legault suggested that it's a $1,300 internal cost by each request. So $5, we want to have open and accessible government, but $1,300 is the internal cost. And with them going up by 30%, we need to change that, Mr. Speaker. In fact, 21,000 requests of all departments of the government are commercial in nature. I used to see this as a corporate lawyer. Companies looking at regulatory issues would just access because there was no barrier to just firing in thousands of requests. So with 55,000 requests on average per year and 30,000 of those commercial requests, that's $71 million cost for law firms, accountancy firms, businesses requesting information. So I've always been an advocate of a zero cost for a member of the public. One of our great people interested in democracy here watching. Zero cost. But a more like a $25 or $50 cost for a corporation other than a media outlet. So that we could actually stop some of the frivolous requests being made clogging the system. full access for John or Jane, public member, but more of a threshold to show that we've changed a bit since 1983. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd refer the Prime Minister and members of his government to his bill from the last Parliament and hope we can amend C-58 to capture some of the promises that have clearly been broken. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.